expand indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot.
That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Well, hello there and welcome to Nowhere to Hide. I'm Brian Hyde, and today we're going to take a little time to talk about an unholy union of media, medicine, and the state. Now, I understand that talking about anything COVID-related is likely to get some people in a tizzy, and so I'm going to tread as carefully as I can, but I'm also going to encourage you to focus less on the gotcha mentality of, this is going to prove once and for all who's on the right side. More than anything, I want you to question, why has the media taken such a staunch advocacy position that just somehow falls in line with what people in authority, both in the state as well as within the medical profession, are saying? I can tell you this, it's not a matter of, well, because they have the facts, they have the science on their side. It's just not that cut and dried. But in particular, there is an Idaho doctor who is, he's just wearing a big target on his back. Perhaps you've heard of Dr. Ryan Cole defending his medical license, saying that complaints against him are political attacks. And apparently he is under attack from the Washington State Medical Commission because he has made public statements that very strongly question the COVID narrative. So I'm going to share with you some excerpts here from this Idaho Capital Sun article. In particular, what I want to ask you to listen for is how everything regarding his statements is crafted as, well, he attempts to say this, or he tries to say this, or he says it's the truth, in quotation marks. But everything that comes from someone who is coming from a position of official authority is presumed to be God's truth. It might as well have been carried down from Mount Sinai with, by Moses personally, written on tablets of stone. So here's how the story begins. The medical board in the state of Washington is considering disciplinary action against Dr. Ryan Cole, the Idaho pathologist who serves on a public health board while advocating against COVID-19 vaccines and accusing other public health agencies of fraud. In a 40-page response to complaints against him, Cole and his attorney argued that he did not violate any rules when he prescribed drugs to patients over telehealth and claimed COVID-19 vaccines are dangerous. But some of the arguments in the response to the Washington Medical Commission do not match Cole's public statements. And this is really the crux of the article, is trying to say, well, he's being accused of, you gave people bad medical advice. But there were many cases where he was expressing opinions. And I'm curious as to where that legal line is. Was he giving medical advice, or was he actually advising a patient? I don't know where that line is, but the article tries to say there is no such line. So the first case in Washington opened last year, stemming from complaints that Cole improperly prescribed drugs to patients over a telehealth platform. Specifically, he was prescribing ivermectin. Now, I don't know if you have experience with this. This is something I actually have personal experience with when a family member came down with COVID earlier this year. And I'm not going to pretend that it's the answer for everybody, but I definitely saw a very marked improvement within 24 hours of administering ivermectin. Now, does that mean it's the panacea? Not necessarily. But why was it treated as something that, they couldn't even begin to prescribe it? They couldn't even talk about it. And in some cases, it was being prohibited from being sent into some states or people having access to it. If it wasn't being dismissed by the media as well, that's just horse dewormer. Bottom line is, that's a decision patients and their doctors should be making. Anyway, he's also accused of spreading false and misleading information about COVID-19, masks, and vaccines. This is, if you want to talk misinformation, you're going to have to at least take into account how many times the official voices, like Dr. Fauci, like Dr. Deborah Birx, like Dr. Walenda from the Center for Disease Control, have changed their tune on these very topics. And I'll have a prime example for this in just a few moments. But interestingly enough, the investigator completed work on that case, forwarded his findings to the commission. There's another case where they're saying that Cole's misdiagnosis of cancer in an Idaho patient was in light of his unsupported claims that COVID-19 vaccines cause cancer. That investigation was ongoing as of early spring. By the way, he's not the only physician that I've heard concerned that perhaps tinkering with the RNA would lead to more incidents of cancer. Here's the thing, though. How long have these vaccines been out? How long have they been readily available? Not even 2 years. So we really don't have a long track record to draw from to say whether that would happen. If he's expressing a concern that it could happen, to me that seems very reasonable. It doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to come to pass, but I think he has every right to opine that this may be dangerous. And frankly, there are some dangers that we have seen are actually quite true, including risk of heart attack or stroke or myocarditis or other heart or blood clotting problems. Now listen to the complaining tone of the article right here. The medical boards in Arizona, Minnesota, and Idaho received similar complaints, the letter from Cole's attorney said. The Idaho Board of Medicine declined to open an investigation of Dr. Cole's practice or his publicly held opinions. The other two states took no further action after he responded to those complaints, the letter said, and it's unclear if those state boards took any action in the 5 months since Cole's letter. Am I alone in sensing just a little sense of disappointment that they didn't go, full ham like the Washington board decided last year when it considered disciplinary action against doctors who give what it calls harmful recommendations about COVID-19 and vaccinations? That policy echoes the position of the Federation of State Medical Boards, but hasn't been adopted by the Idaho Board of Medicine. Physicians who generate and spread COVID-19 misinformation or disinformation erode the public trust in the medical profession and endanger patients, the Washington Medical Commission wrote. Now, look, there's disagreement here, and this is to be expected. Even among scientific and medical professionals, there is still disagreement. And this is actually a healthy thing, as you're going to see a little bit later on in the program. It's not a matter of, there is only one truth and one dogma, and then it starts to take on almost a cult-like religious feel that is totally out of tune with the idea of science, which is always about asking questions and questioning, is this really the best way, or is there another way? Now, if you can show that someone has actually caused harm, I'm willing to consider that, maybe he stepped over a line. But if he's simply questioning whether the one true faith that is being expressed by, these physicians or by various boards of medicine, I don't know that that's necessarily the crime that it's being made out to be. Now, his attorney says that he was questioning the science. In her letter to the commission, Dr. Cole's attorney argued the allegations arise as an attack on public statements and presentations Dr. Cole has offered across the country. She wrote that Cole's statements are questioning the science behind mask wearing, as well as genuine concerns regarding known and unknown complications from COVID-19 vaccinations, rather. To discipline him for those statements would infringe on his constitutionally protected right to free speech, the letter said. No government agency is the arbiter of truth, particularly with respect to matters of scientific opinions and genuine scientific debate. And Dr. Cole has not advised patients or the public to not receive the vaccine. Now, this is where the article really takes exceptions. Oh, yes, he has. But again, I question, if you're expressing an opinion in a public setting, is it just an opinion, or does that constitute medical advice? And I think that's the connection they're trying to make here, is that there really is no difference. But as a physician, I have no problem with him saying maybe you shouldn't take it. For instance, on a conservative podcast, I don't know why they had to point out it's a conservative podcast. If it was just a regular podcast, maybe it would have been okay. But on a conservative one, in June of 2021, he said, if you've had COVID, do not get this shot, especially in the youth and especially if you're under age 50. Cole described the COVID-19 vaccines as something for which the side effect would be death and or permanent disability in a September 2021 interview on another conservative podcast. The host asked Cole, "You're suggesting most people do not get the vaccines, correct?" And he responded, "Very few, very targeted, elderly, and at risk," which, by the way, that's in keeping with what I think most physicians have been saying, even the ones who are firmly on the side of no, get the vaccines. If you're at risk, yeah, maybe you need to consider getting it. But if you're very low risk, maybe it's not the wisest choice, but it's the patient's choice. And they should have a full range of opinions from various medical officials, as well as their own study of the data to decide whether or not it's right for them. Cole has advised the public multiple times to screen before vaccine. What he means here is check and see if you have antibodies. Maybe you've already had COVID. Maybe you already have natural immunity. But he says, don't get that shot because you'll put yourself at higher risk for hospitalization and complications. I know that a year ago, President Biden was talking about if you get the shot, you won't get COVID. Well, he's just been working his way through a bout with COVID after being vaccinated no less than 3 times and boosted. And, obviously that didn't pan out exactly as was expected. Was the shot to prevent getting it, or simply to offer some reassurance that it could have been much worse? It seems the definitions are changing. I mean, we're seeing this almost on a daily basis. It's not just the definitions of what is a vaccine or what is immunity, but in recent days, we've seen the definition of recession redefined on the fly. Today, I kid you not, Wikipedia actually changed the definition of definition. See, this is why I keep real books on hand, because you don't go around editing those every 20 minutes or so to fit whatever political outcome you're looking for. Also, at a similar event in November 2021, Cole said, don't vax the kids with this vax, and if you're COVID recovered, don't get this vax. Now, not everybody has to listen to that advice. Some may say, no, that doesn't sound right to me, and that is perfectly within their purview to say, no, I don't want to follow it. But there are other people who may say that sounds like good advice. And frankly, we probably all know people who have taken that advice and been just fine. Again, if you can show where there's harm, show where the harm is. But this seems to imply that by deviating from the accepted dogma of whatever the medical community has found consensus on, or at least a majority of members have found consensus on, somehow he's doing harm and deserves to be punished. That seems a lot like a witch hunt. The article says the letter argues that Cole is merely sharing opinions based on his observations and offering hypotheses based thereon, and that people filing complaints in the media have simply labeled such opinions and hypotheses as misinformation because there are no published scientific studies completed on this observational question. Now, I understand there are studies out there that seem to prove this or seem to prove that, but again, we have not seen the long-term effects of these vaccines. But we're starting to see some pretty interesting things cropping up, including, if you're familiar with the VAERS system, the Vaccine Adverse Report system, there are some very interesting cases of heart attacks, strokes, blood clots, otherwise healthy young people dropping dead or having to cut short athletic careers after having received the vaccine. Does that mean everybody's going to have that reaction? Of course not. But it does make you wonder why this is starting to become more and more of a common theme. I trust you to use your own Google foo. You do not have to take my word on this. I'm just asking you to question it a little more deeply than it appears most members of the media are willing to question this. In his public statements, the article says Cole refers to his claims as truth. Wow, that's some weaponized parentheses there, or quotation marks here. He attempts to directly link vaccines to dangerous health conditions. Now, I've just outlined, there really are some people who suffer dangerous health conditions, including very young people who otherwise would not be at risk. How do we explain that away? Or do we just try to pretend that that's such a tiny statistical minority that it doesn't really matter? Well, it matters to the parents of kids who have died or otherwise become permanently disabled because of this. So let's not pretend that this is just some kind of quackery that doesn't really exist. Not to mention, if you want to really get a little bit of a kick in the fanny, how about look up sudden adult death syndrome? People are dropping dead. And we're not allowed to question whether this has anything to do with the vaccines that billions of people have received around the world. It's always blamed on something else. Why, it must be climate change, or you're taking too many naps, or perhaps you're eating too much meat, or something else that always seems to fall in line with whatever the latest New Green Deal kind of, or Green New Deal sort of agenda is. It just seems a little bit suspicious. And there were other claims here that again, the reporter and some members of the medical community take exception to. The vaccine regulates and dysregulates genes and immunity. Many young people who get vaccinated won't make it into their 20s or early 30s due to the type of disease they're having. They're going to pass from high-grade cancers, and we literally have a generation to lose if we allow this vaccine into the bodies of our children. Now, again, it's too early to tell, simply because most of them haven't made it into their 20s or 30s. But to raise these concerns, I don't know if it's necessarily a bad idea, especially considering some of the things that are going on right now that really do seem to indicate this vaccine, which was pushed so forcefully and so widely, and especially forced and coerced upon people at the threat of you can't travel, you can't eat here, you can't have a job if you don't get it. It just seems like maybe a few more questions should have been asked. And then, of course, there's this question. Did Cole advise against public health measures? I mean, are they sacred? Are they somehow sacrosanct where he can't even question them? By the time his attorney told the Washington Medical Commission he had not advised patients or the general public to disregard public health guidelines, Cole had become a champion of non-compliance. We've been complacent, you know. The government takes care of you. They're going to take care of you. I'm going to be fine. Whatever. They're going to do their thing. I'll just be a good little boy or girl and comply, he said at a conference in Kansas City in November 2021. And he goes on to say, this is a 1776 moment really in our history. And we're trying to earn our freedoms back? I'm sorry, but I never gave them up. I am an American. Now, the letter to the Washington Medical Commission makes the case for opinion and hypothesis and freedom of speech. But in his public interviews and speeches, he implores the public to listen to him. He accuses health authorities of lying and calls public health measures a crime. At a November 2021 event in Kansas City, he said, it's an honor to be here and to share some truth today. Are they lying to you? Dr. Cole said they are. This is science and data. They pulled the wool over your eyes so they could make billions. Now, that may not rub you the right way, but the fact of the matter is the companies that have made these vaccines, the pharmaceutical companies that have been so heavily invested in this, have done extremely well to the tune of billions upon billions of dollars. Now, you may say, but look at the service that they've provided. Yes, with the help and the coercive arm of government deeply involved. The doctor says the fact that they're forcing you to still wear masks, that they're forcing you to get a shot to keep your employment is criminal, plain and simple. Look, I get it. He's not marching in lockstep with everybody, and frankly, maybe he's in the minority. I don't know. But why should he not be allowed to question what is being said? Why is what he's saying, because it differs from the dogma or at least the orthodoxy that some within the medical community have decided to base their standpoint on, why should it be punished? Why can't it be part of this ongoing reasoning and searching for truth, as opposed to, no, it's just misinformation and disinformation? See, I want to give you an example of what misinformation and disinformation looks like. Thankfully, the internet has a very long memory. You recognize this face? This is Dr. Deborah Birx. She was the former White House COVID response coordinator under President Trump. Back on December 15th of 2020, she told ABC regarding the vaccines, this is one of the most highly effective vaccines we have in our infectious disease arsenal. However, on July 22nd of this year, in other words, just a week ago, she told Fox, I knew these vaccines were not going to protect against infection, and I think we overplayed the vaccines. That was then, this is now. Does what she said back in December of 2020 count as misinformation? Or does she get a pass because, she's part of government, and therefore, where she's coming from a place of authority, will authoritarians just accept it and say, well, it must be good and it must be right because, she's representing the power that we hope to consider that we're a part of? My point is simply this. Whatever consensus may exist, there are also perfectly reasonable voices and reasons for people to question what is being said. In fact, I'm going to give you another example here. This is from an article from Barry Brownstein called State Power Doesn't Settle Science. And he talks about how the claim that a state-proclaimed consensus settles science has resulted in many losing their jobs. For example, in 2021, Dr. Aaron Kheriaty was fired from the University of California, Irvine. Kheriaty was a professor at the School of Medicine and director of medical ethics program there. He was fired for being unvaccinated and for believing that natural immunity was superior to the COVID vaccine. See, he questioned the orthodoxy. Now, he delivered his testimony against a California bill that's currently being proposed that would ban the expression of opposing opinions, would actually strip physicians of their licenses if they question the consensus of these medical organizations. Dr. Kheriaty said, advances in science and medicine typically occur when doctors and scientists challenge conventional thinking or settled opinion. Fixating any medical consensus as unassailable by physicians will stifle medical and scientific progress. And actually, Barry Brownstein in this article points out early on that he gives the story of heart surgeons, and he refers to it here about heart surgeons sprinkling asbestos on the heart of an open heart surgery patient because that was the best practice at the time. But see, back in the 1950s when that was taking place, there was no thought that we should punish doctors who question what we're doing here because, dang it, we have this all figured out. And so eventually they figured out, you know what, these patients are dying pretty quickly. Well, maybe that asbestos had something to do with it. Better practices resulted because people were able to question. Now, Cariotti explained how repressing alternative views creates a false consensus driven by politics and crony interests. Government cures drive out real cures. He added, good science is characterized by conjecture and refutation, lively deliberation, often fierce debate, and always openness to new data. That's why, for example, surgeons no longer use asbestos during open heart surgery. So when bad medicine is not backed by state power, its destructive force is limited. And there is such a thing as bad medicine. There's times where medicine sometimes gets it wrong. But the way to get it right is to make sure that voices are able to question what's going on. Right now, we're seeing a very wholesale effort to limit that debate, to limit any dissent, and the media, unfortunately, seems to be leading the way in trying to prevent that or to discourage it. This attack against Dr. Cole is a pretty good example. Barry Brownstein, in his article, says, the worst scientists in the world can advance their ideas, yet cause little harm if others are free to reject those ideas and experiment with other pathways. As Cariotti and others, such as Karl Popper, pointed out, errors are corrected by conjecture and refutation. Now, here's another fact that probably should be taken into consideration, and that is human beings can be vicious in defending their position. And when the vicious and incompetent deploy the power of government, errors are compounded with deadly consequences. So the more opportunity we have to question these things, and that's not just a wholesale rejection. It's not like, Dr. Cole was suggesting, well, we got to go back to putting leeches on people and bleeding them, when they're sick. He was within his rights to question what was being done. And you should be within your rights to question, what is being prescribed or what others are telling you if it involves your bodily autonomy. There's this thing called informed consent. And it feels as though under the COVID emergency, we have allowed that to be pushed to a corner, or at least pushed to the margins, where informed consent is just, well, that's just the stuff of radicals. Only really extreme people would care about that. And maybe that's the case. But if that is the case, I would rather be on the side of those extreme people who understand it's your body. You need to have the right of refusal if it's something that doesn't agree with you. I want to give you a quote here from F.A. Hayek. This is from his book, The Road to Serfdom. And it's 4 observations that he makes about what happens when science becomes wedded with the state. And this includes medical science as well. Number 1, the whole apparatus for spreading knowledge, the schools and the press, radio and motion picture, will be used exclusively to spread those views, which, whether true or false, will strengthen the belief in the rightness of the decisions taken by the authority. And all information that might cause doubt or hesitation will be withheld. Think about, the suppression of, you can't even talk about ivermectin. I mean, there were whole algorithms on social media that would weed out any post that talked about it. That goes against our standards. That's misinformation. That's disinformation. Number 2, he says the probable effect on the people's loyalty to the system becomes the only criterion for deciding whether a particular piece of information is to be published or suppressed. That does seem to accurately describe the way that many people within the press approach this information on COVID-19 and vaccines and masks and mandates. Number 3, everything which might cause doubt about the wisdom of the government or create discontent will be kept from the people. Number 4, the basis of unfavorable comparisons with conditions elsewhere, the knowledge of possible alternatives to the course actually taken, information which might suggest failure on the part of the government to live up to its promises or to take advantage of opportunities to improve conditions will all be suppressed. I mean, you don't have to be, searching under every bush or looking behind every rock, to find examples of this as it pertains to the way that information about COVID-19 and how it was treated. It's a spooky thing when you start getting government in bed with medicine. And frankly, it makes medicine a lot more difficult to trust because it becomes politicized. And this is true about anything. Anything that becomes politicized, usually because of government involvement, suddenly becomes a political football. It becomes a power struggle. And to see that happen with medicine means that we're playing with something that could be improving and benefiting and prolonging people's lives and correcting problems. And instead, it's becoming a way to exercise power over other people. Something about that just seems wrong. It doesn't seem to pass the ethics and moral sniff test. Now, I want to recommend something that I think you may find useful. This is if you are someone who's inclined to look for the truth. If you're someone who's just looking for comforting words that don't require a whole lot of thought, I would say, well, then just, embrace whatever the media is telling you about this and let them tell you what to do. Be a good little boy or girl, and, they will tell you what they think you need to know. If you are interested in actually taking a look at some very in-depth research and analysis, I highly recommend the Brownstone Institute, brownstone.org. In particular, they have a piece called Articles of Inquiry, The Role of Media. This is from the preface of that article, and it says the media, both traditional and social media, had an outsized role during the pandemic in pushing the U.S. government's COVID response and defending the resulting coercive measures, including lockdowns, school closures, mask and vaccine mandates, while ignoring collateral damage and treating skeptics of these measures as having bad motivations. Is that not what the Idaho Capital Sun article was doing to Dr. Cole? Their result was a one-sided, often factually misleading or unsubstantiated narrative on important issues concerning science, economics, and health for the better part of 2 years. Now, this has had a chilling effect on information flows and journalism, and it dramatically distorted public understanding in many areas, from science to health to economics to the proper role of media in a free society. And a consequence of this shift in the ethos of media, trust has declined dramatically. This is stunning. Only 16% of the total population still trusts what they read in the newspaper. Only 11% still trust what they see on television, with partisan differences in the way that people answer pollsters. So let's talk about some of the questions that remain. These are some of the things that we ought to be asking too. These are things that need to be investigated. Among those questions, to what extent did the media cooperate with the government in the effort to drive one narrative and to suppress competing ones? Were there sociological reasons? Financial? Was it purely a case of the free press acquiescing to government control or imagining themselves to be part of the regime? In which case, what has become of the First Amendment? A free press as opposed to a state press or state-controlled press. And I like this question. Is it right that legacy media alone should be the arbiter of science and admissible opinion? So if you go to brownstone.org, you can find this write-up that's called Articles of Inquiry, The Role of Media. And among the things that it explores media bias. It explores the fact checkers. I know that those fact checkers are there to make sure that you and I don't stray into unfamiliar territory or somehow get misled. But since when do we need fact checkers, especially when it comes to subjective ideas or subjective concepts? Seems like that's taking something a little bit too far. This article explores the role of big tech as well as the experts and the oligarchs, Bill Gates and others like him. Why have they sunk so much money into helping influence some of these vaccine efforts? It takes a very close look and asks a lot of questions about the failed interventions, including mask mandates, including vaccine mandates, as well as, the lockdowns, which, interestingly enough, you're seeing a lot of the public officials deny. Governor Brad Little here in Idaho was definitely on board with locking things down. I mean, come on, police were arresting people for gathering for church. They were arresting people for singing in a church parking lot. They arrested Sarah Brady for taking her kids to the park. The governor was totally okay with that. They were okay with shutting people out of public meetings, which would have continued the state of emergency, would have continued the lockdowns. And now the governor's denying, we never had any lockdowns. He's just gaslighting his way out of this. No, that never happened. That never happened. Again, thankfully, the internet has a long memory. And thankfully, a lot of people remember that too. They question the idea of media conformity as well as the delegitimization campaigns. I would say this article about Dr. Cole probably qualifies as a delegitimization campaign. Also, media ideology, the mantras. If it saves just one life, 2 weeks to flatten the curve, we're all in this together. Oh, there's a bunch of them. And then, of course, they break it down on a media timeline to show how the media helped to perpetuate so many of these COVID-19 narrative talking points that may or may not have squared with reality. And I guess the biggest question here is, can you question those things? Should you question those things? I'd let you make up your own mind. I know that if you were looking for intellectual ammunition, this is a pretty good place to start. Brownstone.org, Articles of Inquiry, the role of media. Look, my goal here is not to get you to hate or shun or obsess over the media, but I would like you to question, are they dealing with me straight? And if the answer is no, then maybe it's time to start thinking about how you get your information, how committed you are to doing your own homework rather than trusting someone else and outsourcing, to them the responsibility for helping you better understand the world around you. Nobody is a better fact checker for what really matters in your life than you are. And there are some things, frankly, that the media obsesses over. I mean, look at how much is reported on Washington, D.C. as if it's the center of the universe. Everything that's anything is taking place there. Really? I imagine there's probably things closer to home that would matter more to you. But the choice is yours. Make that choice wisely. Exercise your capacity to think as clearly and independently as you can. And if you really want to learn something, don't be afraid to step outside of the MSM narrative. And maybe listen to those dissenting voices. You don't have to accept what they're saying necessarily, but you should at least give it some consideration, because once in a while you may just find out that kook out there on the fringes is a kook that got it right. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
Are biased, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand indoctrination.
That's right.
Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot.
That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is influencing policy.